The morning Victoria Ashford walked into Rourke Ranch like she owned the dirt under her boots. She didn't bother knocking. She stepped through the front gate with two hired men flanking her, her dress pressed perfect, her chin lifted at an angle that said she'd already decided how this conversation would end. Della was in the yard, hauling a crate of broken clay pots from the storage shed, hands dirty, hair loose from its braid. Victoria stopped 3 feet away and looked her over. The way a buyer looks at livestock. Slow, dismissive, already disappointed. "You're the mail-order wife." It wasn't a question. Victoria said it the way people say stray dog. Della set the crate down, didn't answer. "I want you to understand something." Victoria stepped closer. "Caleb Rourke has been part of this valley his entire life. His family built half the roads you walked in on. Whatever arrangement you've talked him into, it won't last. Women like you never do." Della looked at her. "Women like me. Without money, without a name, without anything to offer a man of his standing." Victoria smiled, thin and practiced. "You should go back to wherever it is you came from, before you embarrass yourself further." She turned and walked away without waiting for a response, her heels clicking against the packed earth, her men trailing behind her like shadows. Della stood there a moment. Then she picked up the crate and went back to work. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you were trying to build a life, stay with this story. Because what happened next on Rourke Ranch wasn't pretty, and it wasn't fast, and it didn't go the way anyone expected. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Della Voss had not planned to answer a marriage advertisement. She'd been standing in the post office in Mill Haven, a town 3 days' ride from anywhere worth naming, waiting on a letter that never came. The kind of waiting she'd gotten used to after her father's farm went under the previous spring. The drought had taken the crops. The debt had taken the land. And the letter she'd been expecting from her cousin in Missouri, promising work, promising something, had simply never arrived. The advertisement was pinned to the board near the door. Someone had taken it down and put it back up crooked, and she noticed it only because the paper was newer than everything else around it. Seeking a capable woman for household management and marriage. Rourke Ranch, Coldwater Valley. Must be willing to work. No pretense required. No pretense required. She'd read that line 3 times. Most advertisements like that were written by desperate men who wanted a servant they didn't have to pay. She'd seen enough of them in the past year to know the pattern. Flowery language up front, hard reality when you arrived. But this one was blunt in a way that felt almost honest. Whoever wrote it wasn't trying to sell anything. She took the paper anyway, folded it into her coat pocket, told herself she was just keeping it. 2 weeks later, she was on a stage heading west with one trunk, $42, and no real plan beyond getting somewhere new. The valley opened up gradually. You didn't see Rourke Ranch until you were almost on top of it. The land rolled and then flattened, and then there it was, stretching out in every direction like it had always been there and always intended to stay. The main house sat back from the road, 2 stories, solid timber, a wide porch running the full front length. Beyond it, barns, bunkhouses, paddocks, and cattle as far as the light held. Della's first thought was that it was bigger than she'd imagined. Her second thought was that it looked tired. Not falling apart, not neglected in the obvious way. But there was something about it. The way the porch boards had warped and nobody'd replaced them. The way the kitchen garden off the south side of the house had gone to weeds. The way the whole place had the feel of a man who'd stopped caring whether things were orderly or just that they were functional. The driver dropped her trunk at the base of the porch steps and turned around without ceremony. She stood there with her hand on her trunk and waited. A man came out from around the side of the house, not from the front door. He was wiping his hands on a rag, and he stopped when he saw her, like he'd miscalculated when she'd arrive. He was taller than she'd expected, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual work, not just standing around looking imposing. His face was weathered and not particularly welcoming. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Rourke." He looked at her the way you look at something you're not sure fits where you need it to go. "You're smaller than I thought you'd be," he said. "You're ruder than your advertisement suggested," she said back. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite irritation. He tucked the rag into his back pocket and came toward her. "You eat on the road?" "Not since this morning." Kitchen's around back. I'll have someone show you. I'd like to see it myself. He stopped. It's just a kitchen. It's the room I'll be spending most of my time in, Della said. I'd like to see it before I agree to anything. A long pause. He studied her face like he was trying to figure out whether she was serious. She was. Fine, he said. This way. The kitchen was worse than the outside had suggested. The iron stove was functional, but hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Grease had built up along the burner plates, and one of the vents was partially blocked. The dry storage shelves along the east wall were a tangle of mismatched containers, open bags, and at least 3 different types of grain, all stored in the same section without any labeling. A barrel of flour near the door had begun to sour from moisture. The table in the center was large enough, but 2 of its legs had been repaired badly, and it wobbled. Caleb stood in the doorway behind her while she moved through the room. She opened a cabinet, closed it, checked the condition of the water supply access at the back sink, looked at the state of the pots hanging on the wall. Some good, some with cracked handles or damaged bases that had clearly been cooking unevenly for years. "Who's been cooking for your men?" she asked. "One of the hands, Burl. He does it when he's not on cattle duty. And your men have been eating what Burl makes." "They've been eating." Della turned around. "Mr. Rourke, I need to be direct with you about something." "All right." "I did not come all the way out here to cook in a broken room. This kitchen cannot produce food for 20 men, or for anyone, the way it currently sits. The stove needs attention, the storage needs to be reorganized completely, and that flour barrel needs to go outside before it draws anything you don't want inside your walls." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You've been here 10 minutes. I've been around kitchens my whole life. I know what I'm looking at. The men haven't complained. The men are eating whatever they're given and calling it fine because they don't have another option," Della said. "That's not the same thing as things being all right." His jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being corrected. That was clear enough. "What exactly are you proposing?" he said. "I'm proposing that before I agree to cook one meal in this kitchen, you agree to let me fix it, not replace everything. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for the time and materials to put it right. After that, I'll do what I came here to do." The silence stretched between them. "You're telling me," Caleb said slowly, "that you won't start work until you've renovated my kitchen." "I'm telling you that I won't produce food worth eating out of a room in this condition. If you want meals your men will actually benefit from, then yes. That's what I'm telling you." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen without a word. Della stood there and wondered if she'd just ended the whole arrangement before it began. He came back 20 minutes later. "There's hardware in the second barn, east side, lumber stacked along the north wall. You need anything specific, tell Gideon. He's my foreman. He'll get it." He paused. "You'll need to tell him yourself. He doesn't take orders from anyone he hasn't sized up." "I can manage that," Della said. Caleb nodded once and left again. She stood in that kitchen alone for a moment, looking at the mess of it, already moving things around in her head. What would stay? What would go? What needed repairing versus what needed replacing outright? There was more to work with than it first appeared. The bones of the room were solid. The problems were all maintenance, things that had been allowed to slide because nobody had been paying attention, or because nobody had cared enough to stop and notice. She pushed up her sleeves and started with the flour barrel. Gideon Hale was a lean man in his 50s with a face that had been outdoors through decades of weather and didn't have much patience left for nonsense. He found her in the south yard examining the condition of the kitchen garden and did not look pleased about being summoned. "Mr. Rourke says you need supplies," he said. "Correct." Della looked up from the garden bed. "I need a list of what's already in the hardware store so I don't ask for things you already have. I'll also need 2 men for 2 days to help carry materials." Gideon looked at her like she'd asked him to move a mountain. "My men are on cattle rotation." "I understand that. I'm asking for 2, for 2 days. I'll work around whatever schedule you need." "What's in the kitchen isn't my problem, ma'am." "It will be," Della said, "when your men start getting sick from food prepared in contaminated storage conditions. That flour barrel alone is a problem, but I imagine you've been too busy to notice." A pause. Gideon had the look of a man recalibrating. "You're saying the kitchen's a health risk," he said. "I'm saying there are conditions in that room that no cook worth her salt would accept. I'm not asking for luxury. I'm asking for sanitation and function." She met his eyes. 2 men, 2 days. After that, I'll feed your crew better than they've eaten in a year." Another pause. "I'll see what I can spare," Gideon said. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't refusal either. Della took it. The days that followed were not graceful. She worked from before dawn to after dark. The two men Gideon sent, a younger hand named Pete and an older man everyone called Coop, were polite enough but clearly uncertain about what they'd been assigned to. They were cattlemen. The kitchen was foreign territory. But Della didn't need them to understand the kitchen. She needed them to carry things, hold things in place while she worked, and stay out of her way when she was figuring something out. They managed all three. She replaced the damaged sections of the stove's ventilation herself, using a technique her mother had shown her years ago that involved careful work with a metal rasp and patience more than skill. She reorganized the dry storage entirely, labeled containers, separated grains, checked everything for moisture damage, threw out what was too far gone, and arranged what remained so that a person could find what they needed without pulling half the shelf apart. The table she fixed by resetting the poorly repaired legs and adding cross-bracing underneath. It didn't wobble anymore. It probably never should have. She scrubbed every surface twice. On the third evening, she cooked a full meal for the ranch. Not anything elaborate, just roasted meat with root vegetables and fresh bread from flour that wasn't compromised. But she cooked it properly, with attention to timing and seasoning and the simple fact that food should taste like something. The 20 ranch hands came through the line without much comment. Cowboys didn't tend to say a lot about meals. They ate, they left, they got back to work. But Pete stopped at the end of the line and looked down at his plate. Then he looked up at Della. "This is real food," he said. It sounded almost confused. "It's supposed to be," she said. He nodded and walked away. That was all. But Gideon, who'd come through last, as was his habit, paused long enough to look at the kitchen around him, organized, clean, functioning, and then at Della, and gave her the smallest nod she'd ever seen a man produce. She filed it away as a win. Okay. Caleb ate in the main house, separate from the crew. That had apparently been his practice for years. Della didn't think much of it. Some owners kept that distance. But on the fourth evening, she set a plate on the table in the main dining room and sat down at the far end with her own. He came in and stopped. "What are you doing?" he said. "Eating dinner," she said. "You can stand in the doorway or you can sit down. Either way, I'm going to eat while it's hot." A long pause. He sat down. They ate in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence, exactly. More like two people who didn't yet know what to say to each other and weren't going to manufacture words to fill the gap. Finally, Caleb said, "The men seem to be in better spirits." "Good food does that," Della said. "You fixed the kitchen faster than I expected." "I had help." "Gideon said you were efficient." Della looked up. "Gideon said that?" Something crossed Caleb's face, almost amusement. "He said you were efficient and that you knew what you were talking about. From Gideon, that's approximately the same as a written commendation." Della went back to her food. "He was helpful. He didn't have to be." "No," Caleb agreed. "He didn't." Another silence. "You didn't expect this to be what it is," he said. Not accusatory, just a statement. "I didn't know what to expect," she said honestly. "The advertisement was vague." "I wrote it that way on purpose." "I know. I figured that out." He looked at her. "And yet you came anyway." "I needed somewhere to be," she said. "That's not a romantic answer, but it's the true one." He seemed to appreciate that. He nodded once, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected. "All right," he said. They finished dinner without saying much else. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Della hadn't expected to find. She was up before anyone else. The kitchen was hers in those early hours. Dark outside, the stove warming, the first batch of bread already started. There was something in that quiet that settled her. It wasn't peace exactly, more like purpose. She had things to do and she knew how to do them, and for a woman who'd spent the better part of a year feeling like she was falling sideways, that was worth more than she could easily put into words. She learned the ranch's patterns by watching. The crew ran on a strict schedule that Gideon maintained without apparent effort. Rotations, duties, the whole machinery of managing 20 men and thousands of cattle across more land than she could walk in a day. She fit herself into that schedule the way a piece of trim fits into joinery. Not forcing, just finding the right place. The men stopped treating her like an unknown element after the first week. Not that they were warm about it, cowboys weren't naturally warm, but they acknowledged her when she crossed the yard. They didn't look through her. Pete had apparently told some version of that first meal story to the others, because there was a quality to how they came through the food line now. More attentive, less automatic. Coop, the older hand, started leaving kindling stacked near the kitchen door every morning. He never mentioned it. She never brought it up, but it was there every day. About 6 weeks in, she found the garden. She'd been looking for a place to relocate some of the herbs she'd been growing in pots. The kitchen window was too dark for them, and they were getting leggy. She went around to the south side of the house and found a gate in the fence she hadn't noticed before. It was latched, but not locked. Inside was a garden space, not large, maybe 30 feet by 40, with raised beds and a stone path running through the center. Someone had planted it with care, years ago. The design of it was deliberate, but it had been abandoned. The beds were overgrown, the path cracked where weeds had pushed up through the stone joints, the small fruit trees at the far end, unpruned to the point where they'd grown into each other. She stood there looking at it for a long time. She didn't ask about it that evening. She waited. 2 nights later, over dinner, she mentioned it casually. I found the garden behind the south fence. Caleb's hands went still on his utensils. I was looking for a spot for the herbs, she continued, keeping her voice even. I didn't touch anything. I just looked. A long pause. That garden's not for use, he said. I gathered that. Leave it as it is. All right. She didn't push. She watched his face and saw something in it she hadn't expected. Not anger, exactly. Something older. The kind of expression a person gets when a door opens that they'd gotten used to keeping shut. She thought about that garden for a long time afterward. She didn't touch it, but she didn't stop thinking about it either. The trouble with Victoria Ashford started earlier than Della might have predicted. She'd heard the name in town. Coldwater Valley's nearest settlement was 3 miles from the ranch, and Della made the trip every week or so for supplies. People talked. They always did in small places. Victoria Ashford's family was old money, which in the territory meant they'd been there 2 decades instead of 1. Her father had owned timber rights. Now she ran the family's various interests and considered herself the natural social center of the valley. The first time Della saw her in person was outside the general store. Victoria was speaking with another woman, loudly enough that her voice carried across the street. She stopped talking when Della came out of the store, looked at her with an evaluating stillness, and then turned back to her companion and said something quiet that made the other woman glance over and then quickly look away. Della kept walking, but she'd seen enough to understand what she was dealing with. That same evening, Caleb came into the kitchen while she was finishing the dinner prep. He leaned against the doorframe. He had a habit of not fully entering a room, like he was always keeping one option open. "You went to town today," he said. "I needed salt and dried fruit. We were running low." "Did you have any trouble?" She looked at him. He was asking about something specific. "Not exactly," she said. He nodded slowly. He had the look of a man who knew something he wasn't sure how to say. "Victoria Ashford," he said finally. "I saw her. She'll be a problem." Della turned back to the stove and gave the pot a stir. "I've dealt with problems before." "Not like her," Caleb said. "She has influence in this valley, real influence, the kind that can make things difficult in ways that aren't obvious until they already have." "What kind of things?" "She controls who gets contracts, who gets credit at the bank, who's seen as respectable and who isn't." He paused. "She thought before you came, that she and I had an understanding." Della turned around fully now. "Did you?" "No." His voice was flat. "But she believed we did. And Victoria Ashford is not a woman who adjusts her beliefs easily." Della thought about that for a moment. "Are you warning me?" "I'm telling you to be careful in town," he said. "That's all." "I'm always careful," she said. He looked at her, and for a second she had the odd feeling he wasn't quite sure what to do with her, like she was something he'd expected to be one thing and kept finding was something else. "All right," he said, and left. There was one evening near the end of the second month when everything sat differently. She'd been up since 4 in the morning. A problem with one of the storage bins, a seam had split and grain was going to waste, had taken most of the morning to fix. And then the midday meal had been later than she wanted. And then she'd spent the afternoon helping Coop repair a section of fence near the kitchen yard because nobody else was available, and the gap was large enough to be a problem. By the time dinner was done and the kitchen cleaned, it was full dark, and she was sitting on the back step with her boots off, eating the last of the bread that hadn't gone to the crew, not because she was particularly hungry, but because she hadn't had time to eat properly all day. She heard steps and looked up. Caleb was coming from the direction of the main barn. He saw her, slowed, and came to a stop a few feet away. He looked at her for a moment, at the bread in her hand, at the dirt on her forearms, at the general state of her. "You haven't eaten today," he said. "I'm eating now." "That's bread." "It's good bread," she said. He made a sound that was somewhere between a snort and a sigh. He went inside. She heard him in the kitchen, cabinet doors, the clink of a pan. After a while, he came back out with a plate and sat down on the step beside her. Not close, just beside. He'd put together something from the leftovers, cold meat, some of the roasted vegetables from dinner, a bit of the soft cheese she'd made earlier in the week. He set it down next to her without saying anything and looked out at the dark yard. She looked at the plate, then at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She ate. He sat there. Neither of them spoke for a while. Above them the sky was enormous and full of stars, the way it only is when you're genuinely far from anywhere. After a while he said, "My wife planted that garden, the one behind the south fence." Della was quiet. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "It was quick. Fever, wasn't anything. There was nothing to be done." He paused. "I haven't been in that garden since." "I won't go in it," Della said. "I know you won't." He said it like it was a fact he'd already settled. "I just wanted you to know what it was." She nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything about healing or moving forward or any of the things people felt compelled to say in those moments. She just sat there with him in the dark and let it be what it was. After a while, he went inside. She sat on the step a bit longer, looking up at the stars, and thought that this man was more complicated than she'd let herself assume. That the ranch around her, the organized chaos of it, the crew and the cattle, and the broken things that were slowly becoming less broken, was also more than she'd bargained for. And that she was, perhaps, exactly where she needed to be, even if the road that had gotten her here had been humiliating and frightening and nothing like anything she'd planned. She wasn't sure what that meant yet, but she was willing to find out. She picked up the plate he'd brought her, went inside, and washed it clean before she went to bed. The morning after Caleb sat with her on the back step, nothing was said about it. He came through the kitchen at his usual hour, took his coffee, nodded once in her direction, and walked out the front door. Della watched him go and understood, without needing it explained, that the previous evening existed in a separate category, something that had happened and would not be revisited in daylight, at least not yet. She was fine with that. She'd grown up around men who processed things slowly and privately, and she had no interest in forcing conversations that weren't ready to happen. She went back to the bread dough she'd been working and thought about the garden behind the south fence. Not about entering it, she'd meant what she said about that, but about the fact that it existed, that behind the competent, controlled exterior of this ranch and this man, there was a locked gate with a stone path going nowhere and fruit trees growing into each other because nobody had been able to bring themselves to touch them. It told her something about Caleb Rourke that no amount of conversation could have. Whatever he'd been before his wife died, he'd spent 3 years since then building walls in the shape of productivity. The ranch was enormous and successful and running at full capacity, and he was completely alone inside of it. She punched the dough down harder than necessary and flipped it on the board. It wasn't her problem to solve. She knew that. She hadn't come here to fix a man. She'd come here because she had nowhere else to go, and this had been the only door that opened. The arrangement was practical. She managed the household. She cooked. She kept the place running at a level it clearly hadn't been at for years. That was the deal. That was what she'd signed on for. She shaped the loaves and set them to rise and went to check on the storage bins. The grain situation had stabilized, but the winter stores were still thinner than she liked. Della had grown up watching her mother calculate food through seasons like she was balancing a ledger. How much you needed, how much you had, what happened to the difference when something went wrong. That math had kept their family fed through 2 bad winters when the crops underperformed and money ran short. She ran the same calculations now across Rourke Ranch's supplies, and what she found wasn't reassuring. They had enough for the current crew through early winter, but if prices went up in town, and she'd heard enough at the general store to know that was likely, with several supply routes having been disrupted by flooding further north, they'd be short by February or March. She brought it to Caleb that evening. He was in the office at the back of the main house, a room she hadn't been in before. It was crowded with the kind of organized chaos that meant a man who was good at his actual work but didn't much care about the surface of things. Papers in stacks that had a system she couldn't immediately read, maps pinned to the wall, a ledger open on the desk. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. "I have a supply concern," she said. He gestured at the chair across from the desk. She sat. She laid it out plainly. Current inventory, projected usage, the weather variables, what she'd heard about pricing. She didn't embellish and she didn't downplay. She gave him the numbers the way she'd want them given to her. He listened without interrupting. That was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't talk over people when they were giving him information he needed. He waited until she was finished, then sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You think we should buy forward," he said. "I think we should consider it. It costs more now than waiting, but if the prices jump the way I think they will, we'd be looking at significantly more in January. And if the stores run short in the middle of winter, we lose options." "What kind of quantities are you thinking?" She told him. He didn't flinch at the numbers, which she took as a sign that the ranch's finances were as solid as its reputation suggested. "I'll talk to the supply house in Mill Haven this week," he said. "You have a list?" "I'll have it ready tomorrow morning." He nodded, then, almost as an afterthought, "This is a good catch. Most people wouldn't think about it until January." She stood up. "Most people didn't spend 3 years watching their family's farm fail one season at a time," she said. It came out more direct than she'd intended, but she didn't apologize for it. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I suppose they didn't." She went back to the kitchen. The supply list led to a joint trip to Mill Haven, which Della hadn't expected. Caleb apparently intended to negotiate directly with the supply house owner, a man named Barton, who he'd done business with for years, and he'd asked her to come along to confirm the specifications, since she'd be the one working with the materials. She'd agreed without much thought, and it was only when they were 3/4 of the way to town in the wagon that she realized it was the first time she'd been somewhere with him rather than simply in proximity to him at the ranch. He drove. She sat with her list in her coat pocket and watched the land roll past. "How long has your family been in this valley?" she asked, mostly because the silence had started to develop a texture. "My father built the original cabin in 1849, Caleb said. "I was born 2 years later, spent my whole life in that valley." He paused. "You?" "Illinois originally. My father's family farmed outside Springfield for 2 generations. We moved further west when I was 11. Kept moving." She looked out at the hills. "We were good at starting things, not as good at staying." "What happened to the farm?" "Same thing that happens to a lot of farms. Couple of bad years in a row, then a debt that got ahead of us, then a drought that made the debt permanent." She said it matter-of-factly, because it was a matter of fact. "My father died the winter before last. After that, there wasn't much reason to stay and fight for land that was already gone." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your father." "He was a stubborn man," Della said. "He'd have liked it here, probably. All this space." She looked at the horizon. "He was always better with land than with people." "Most men out here are," Caleb said. She glanced at him. "Are you?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Better with land than people?" "Yeah, by a long stretch." A beat. "My wife used to say I could read a pasture better than I could read a room." Was she right? "Completely," he said. The word came out with something that might have been fond and something that might have been grief, both at the same time, and she recognized it because she'd felt similar things about her father. They rode the rest of the way to town in a silence that had changed character. Less like 2 strangers and more like 2 people who had told each other something true and were sitting with it. Barton at the supply house was a round man with an excellent memory for prices and a poor memory for names. He called Caleb Rourke and called Della Mrs. Rourke, which made her blink the first time she heard it, though she didn't correct him. The negotiation took the better part of an hour. Caleb was calm and unhurried in a way that Della suspected masked real firmness underneath, because Barton's opening prices came down considerably before they were through. She'd confirmed quantities and specifications twice, caught one error in what Barton had written down, and prevented a misunderstanding about delivery timing that would have meant a 2-week gap in their flour supply. Barton looked at her over his counter with a reassessing expression. "Your wife knows her provisions," he told Caleb, as if Della weren't standing 3 feet away. "She does," Caleb said. "Sharp woman." "Yes," Caleb said, and moved on to the next line item on the list without making any particular ceremony of it. She found herself unexpectedly moved by that, not by the compliment, which was backhanded at best, but by the straightforwardness of his agreement. Some men in his position would have laughed it off or redirected. He'd just said yes and kept working, like it was obvious. They were loading the first portion of the order into the wagon when she noticed Victoria Ashford across the street. Victoria was standing outside the milliner's shop with 2 women. Della recognized vaguely from previous town visits, both from families with established social position in the valley. All 3 of them were watching the wagon. When Della met Victoria's gaze, Victoria didn't look away. She held the look for a measured 3 seconds, and then turned back to her companions with a small, deliberate smile. Della tied down the last section of the load and climbed up onto the wagon bench. "She was watching," Caleb said quietly. He'd seen it too. "I know. She'll have something to say about this." "She'll have something to say about everything," Della said. "That's not something I can stop." He looked at her for a moment. Then he clicked the horses forward. Well, the something Victoria had to say reached them before the week was out. It came through Pete, who'd heard it in town and brought it back with the reluctant expression of a man who knows delivering news is necessary but wishes someone else had the job. He found Della in the yard and asked if she had a minute, and then told her with visible discomfort that people in town were saying that Caleb Rourke's new wife was a hired woman who'd answered a classified advertisement looking for any situation that would keep her fed, and that the marriage wasn't any kind of real arrangement. It was charity, essentially, and Della ought to know the distinction. Pete's face was red by the time he'd finished. "I don't believe it," he said. "I just thought you should hear it from someone decent before you heard it some other way." Della looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Pete." "It's not right," he said. "What you've done for this ranch." "It's all right," she said. "I appreciate you telling me." He nodded and walked away quickly, clearly relieved the conversation was over. Della stood in the yard for a moment and let it settle. Then she picked up the basket she'd set down and went back inside. The truth was that Victoria wasn't entirely wrong about the facts. Della had answered an advertisement. She had needed a situation that would keep her fed and housed. Those things were true. What Victoria was wrong about, what she was deliberately distorting, was the meaning of those facts, as if needing something made a person less than, as if arriving somewhere without resources meant you were incapable of building them, as if survival was something to be ashamed of. She knew that logic. She'd heard versions of it her whole life, usually from people who'd never had to survive anything, and therefore confused luck with merit. She set the basket down on the kitchen table and started sorting through the dried herbs she'd been collecting. It was not going to be the last thing Victoria said. She understood that clearly. This was the opening move in something that intended to go further. The question was whether she was going to let it matter. She brought it up with Caleb that evening, not because she needed him to do something about it, but because she thought he should know. He listened with his arms crossed and the particular stillness he got when he was containing something. "She's testing ground," he said when she'd finished. "I know that. She wants to see how you respond." "I know that too." Della looked at him. "I'm not going to respond, not in any way she can use. I'm just going to keep working." Something shifted in his expression. Something she might have called approval, though it was quieter than that, more like confirmation. "That's the right call," he said. "I thought so." She paused. "But I wanted you to know what she was saying, because some of it's going to come back around to you, the way these things do." He nodded slowly. "I can handle Victoria Ashford." "I believe you," she said. "I just didn't want you to hear it from someone else and wonder why I hadn't mentioned it." He looked at her. "You thought about what I'd think about it." "Of course I did." Another pause. He uncrossed his arms and seemed to settle slightly. "Thank you," he said. It came out roughly, like a word he didn't deploy often. "Don't thank me," she said. Just, if it gets louder, tell me. I will, he said. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it, and that was more than she'd expected when she'd walked into this kitchen 2 months ago with her one trunk and her $42 and her total uncertainty about what she'd gotten herself into. Oh. It was Gideon who created the first real rupture. Not intentionally, Gideon was, as far as Della could tell, constitutionally opposed to anything that wasted time, and drama fell firmly into the waste category in his accounting. But he came to her one morning in October with a problem he'd clearly been thinking about for several days before deciding to bring it to her, which she knew because of the way he led up to it. He talked about the supply situation first. Good, things were handled. Then he mentioned the crew's general condition. Fine, better than usual. Then he stood in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and told her that 2 of the younger ranch hands had gotten into a serious argument 3 nights prior, that one of them had a bruised jaw and the other a cut across his forearm, and that Caleb had handled it, but that the underlying issue, the 2 men genuinely couldn't work in proximity without things escalating, was still unresolved. Why are you telling me? Della said. Because Caleb told them to work it out, and they haven't, Gideon said. And because you've got a way with people on this crew that I don't have and Caleb doesn't have. She looked at him. You're asking me to mediate a fight between 2 cowboys. I'm asking if you have any ideas, he said, with the dignity of a man who would rather chew gravel than admit he needed help with people. The 2 of them are on opposite rotations now, but that can't hold all winter. Eventually they're going to be on the same fence line at 3 in the morning in the middle of a freeze, and someone's going to do something stupid. She thought about it. What was the fight about? One of them said the other wasn't carrying his weight on a drive. Other one said the first was lying to make himself look better to me. Which one was right? Gideon's mouth pressed flat. Some of both. She nodded. Bring them through for breakfast separately this week. Different times. I want to talk to each of them. You want to talk to them? Yes. He thought about this. About what? About breakfast mostly, she said. Sometimes people say things they won't say anywhere else when they've got food in front of them, and someone's being normal with them. I'm not going to interrogate anyone. I'm just going to give them a place to be human for 20 minutes. Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on. All right, he said. It worked eventually, though not quickly and not cleanly. The younger one, a kid named Roland, who was about 19 and had been trying too hard to prove himself since he arrived, turned out to be desperate for any indication that he was doing adequate work, and nobody on a crew like that was going to volunteer encouragement without being pushed. The older one, a man named Declan, who was 30 and had been on cattle crews his whole life, had the kind of lockdown pride that made asking for fairness feel like weakness. She didn't tell them what to do. She didn't lecture them. She fed them and asked them questions about their work and listened, and at some point in each conversation she said something that was just the truth, plainly, that the crew noticed effort even when they didn't say so. That being wrong about something didn't mean you were wrong about everything. The 2 men who were both competent had no reason to tear each other down. Small things. Things that cost nothing to say. A week later, Gideon reported that the 2 men had voluntarily taken the same fence rotation without being assigned to it. He told her this in the kitchen doorway. Whatever you did, he said, it worked. I didn't do much, she said. You did enough, he said. And then because he was Gideon and could only go so far in any given conversation before retreating to something practical. The bread's better this week. More salt? A little, she said. He nodded and left. November came in hard. The temperature dropped fast. The wind off the open range had an edge to it that made outdoor work into an endurance test, and the shorter days compressed everything. The crew came in earlier, ate more, slept heavier, and the general atmosphere of the bunkhouse shifted into the particular closed-in intensity of men who knew they were entering the long dark part of the year. Della had been preparing for this. The stores were solid, the kitchen was warm, and she'd adjusted the meal schedule to accommodate the crew's altered hours. She'd also, over the previous weeks, figured out which of the men had specific needs she could address without making it awkward. Coop's hands were bad enough in the cold that she'd started making sure his morning coffee was poured and waiting before he had to hold a kettle, without drawing any attention to why. Roland, who homesick miserable and was doing a creditable job of hiding it, got extra portions without comment, because a 19-year-old doing hard physical labor in freezing temperatures needed the calories and the small dignity of not having to ask. These were not grand gestures. They were just paying attention, doing the thing that was needed because it was needed. But they accumulated, and she knew they accumulated, because she'd watched it happen on her family's farm. The way consistent small acts of competence and care built something in a place, a quality of safety that people responded to even when they couldn't name it. Caleb noticed. She knew he noticed because he started coming into the kitchen more frequently, not always for a specific reason, sometimes just passing through, sometimes with a question that could have waited. She didn't make anything of it. She just answered when he asked something and otherwise let him move through the space as he wanted. One evening in mid-November, she was working on the season's first batch of preserves. She'd found a supply of dried cherries at a price she couldn't pass up and had been planning this batch for weeks. The smell of it cooking was warm and sharp and slightly sweet and filled the whole kitchen. Caleb stopped in the doorway and stood there longer than usual. "What is that?" he said. "Sour cherry preserve," she said. Patience and a lot of stirring. He came into the kitchen and stood near the stove, looking at the pot. "My wife used to make something similar," he said. "Different fruit. But the smell—" He stopped. She didn't turn around. She kept stirring. "Tell me about her," she said. "If you want." A long pause. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "She came out here from Ohio. Her family thought she was out of her mind for going west with a man who had 30 acres and a promise." He was quiet for a moment. "She planted that garden the first spring we were here. Said she wasn't going to live somewhere that didn't grow anything beautiful." "She sounds determined," Della said. "She was the most stubborn person I've ever met," he said. And then, very quietly, "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Della smiled at the pot, where he couldn't see it. The best people usually are. He stood there a while longer. Then he said, "You don't have to do this." "The preserves?" "This. All of it." He gestured vaguely. "The extra work. The things you do for the men that nobody asked you to do. You could just cook the meals and run the storage and meet the terms of what we agreed to." She considered the pot for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Is that what you want me to do?" He met her eyes. "No," he said. "Then stop asking me to justify doing more," she said. It came out without heat, just as a simple fact. "I know how to run a household. I know what people need. I'm going to do those things because they matter. You can call it extra work if you want to, but that's just what the work is." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Now let me finish this batch before the temperature drops," she said. He stepped back and let her work. But he didn't leave right away. He stayed near the doorway, not talking, and she was aware of him there the way you're aware of a fire in a cold room. Not a distraction, just a presence that altered the temperature of things. After a while he said, "Margaret would have liked you." Della kept her eyes on the pot and didn't say anything for a moment. "I think I would have liked her," she said finally. He left, and she kept stirring, and the kitchen smelled of sour cherries and winter coming on, and she thought that something in this house had shifted in a way she hadn't predicted and wasn't sure yet what to do with. Something underneath the practical, underneath the daily work and the supply lists and the crew management. Something that didn't have a name she was ready to use yet. She filled the first jar, pressed the lid down, set it carefully on the shelf. Outside, the wind came up against the walls of the house, and the timbers of the kitchen creaked against it, the way a solid old structure does, not giving, just acknowledging the pressure. She put up every jar that evening and labeled them in her careful hand. And when she went to bed, the kitchen was clean and the preserves were lined up on the shelf, and the smell of them was still faintly in the air. She lay in the dark and thought about Margaret's garden behind the south fence, sleeping under its first frost of the season, and about a man who had loved someone stubborn and good, and hadn't known yet what to do with the fact that life had handed him a second chance he hadn't asked for, and about herself. A woman who had come here with $42 and nothing to lose, and what it meant that she was beginning, slowly and with some alarm, to realize she had something here worth protecting. She wasn't ready to say what that something was, but she knew it was there, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The preserves sat on the shelf through December without incident, which was the last quiet stretch of that winter. January came in with the kind of cold that made the ranch feel smaller. Everything pulled inward, the crew moving between bunkhouse and barn and kitchen in tight, efficient patterns, nobody lingering outside longer than the work required. The cattle needed more attention in the freeze, which meant Caleb and Gideon were out in the pre-dawn dark most mornings. And the days had a particular exhausted quality that Della had learned to read by now. She adjusted the meals accordingly, heavier, warmer, the kind of food that put something back into a body that had been working in wind and ice since before sunrise. She'd stopped thinking of the ranch as a temporary arrangement sometime around Thanksgiving, though she hadn't said so to anyone. The realization had arrived without ceremony, the way most true things did. She'd been standing in the kitchen one morning listing what needed to happen that week, and the list had extended 6 weeks out without her thinking about it, and she'd understood then that she was planning a future here. Not performing the idea of it, actually planning. Whether that was wise was a different question, one she set aside when there was bread to make. The trouble with Victoria Ashford returned in January through a mechanism Della hadn't anticipated: money. It came to her attention through Barton at the supply house, who mentioned it with the careful awkwardness of a man who did business with several parties and preferred not to be caught in the middle of anything. He'd been contacted, he said, by a representative of a merchant consortium. He didn't name Victoria directly, but the implication was plain enough, about whether Rourke Ranch's accounts were current. They were. Della had seen the ledgers. Caleb ran a tight financial operation and had no outstanding debts with any supplier in the valley, but the question had been asked. That was the point. And questions like that, in small communities where reputation was currency, left a residue even when the answer was perfectly clean. She told Caleb that evening. He sat with it for a moment, hands flat on the table. "She's looking for a pressure point," he said. "She didn't find one." "No, but she's telling people she's looking." He was quiet for a beat. "That's the message." Della nodded. She'd understood that too. Victoria wasn't trying to damage the ranch financially. She knew as well as anyone that Rourke Ranch was solid. She was establishing that she could ask the question, that she had enough reach to make the asking itself mean something. "What do you want to do?" Della said. Caleb looked at her. "Nothing yet," he said. "She wants a reaction. We don't give her one. And if she escalates? Then we deal with what she actually does," he said, "not what she might do." It was the right call, and she knew it. It was also harder than it sounded because doing nothing while someone worked against you required a particular discipline, the ability to sit with discomfort and not reach for the nearest response just because responding felt better than waiting. She was better at that than she used to be. The year before she'd arrived here had trained her well in the practice of endurance without action. The community meeting in late January was not something she'd planned to attend. Coldwater Valley held monthly gatherings at the town hall during winter. Part civic business, part social event. The kind of gathering that small frontier communities used to hold themselves together through the months when travel was difficult and isolation could become its own problem. Caleb usually went, briefly, handled whatever needed handling, and came back. He asked Della if she'd like to come. She looked at him. "You don't usually ask." "I'm asking now," he said. She understood what he was doing. Taking her to a public gathering, in plain view of everyone in the valley, was a statement that didn't require words. He was placing her, visibly, in a position that contradicted the narrative Victoria had been circulating. It was strategic. It was also, she thought, something more than purely strategic, though she wasn't going to press on that. "All right," she said. "I'll come." The town hall was a large timber building that smelled of pine and lamp oil and the accumulated memory of 100 similar meetings. About 60 people had made the effort in the cold. Ranching families, merchants, the local doctor, several prominent landowners, and their wives. Della walked in beside Caleb and felt the shift in the room the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. Subtle, atmospheric, the kind of thing your body registers before your mind does. People looked. Not rudely, most of them, but with the careful attention of people recalibrating information they'd received secondhand. She kept her face neutral and her posture straight, and she looked back at the people who looked at her, which was the only dignified option. Victoria was there, naturally. She was standing near the far wall with a group that included the mayor, a man named Alderton, and 2 of the valley's larger landowners. She was dressed with the particular precision of a woman who understood that clothing was a form of argument, and she was watching the door when Della and Caleb walked through it. Their eyes met. Victoria smiled. It was the kind of smile that is designed to communicate that it is not, in fact, a smile. Della had been on the receiving end of that expression enough times in her life to read it accurately. I see you. I've already decided what you are. We both know this isn't over. Della gave her a small nod, polite, unhurried, the acknowledgement you'd give anyone, and turned to the woman on her left who just said something to her about the cold snap. The meeting itself was uneventful. Road maintenance, water rights on a creek that ran along 3 property boundaries, a proposal about a shared purchase of equipment that the smaller farms couldn't afford individually. Caleb spoke twice, briefly, and said what needed saying without embellishment. Several people addressed him with the particular deference that came from years of established respect, and Della watched how he handled it, not with warmth exactly, but with a consistency that was its own kind of reliability. During the break, when people moved around and conversations fragmented into smaller clusters, a woman named Helen Marsh found her way to Della's side. She was somewhere in her 50s, with the direct, weather-worked look of a woman who'd been ranching her own land for decades. Her husband had died some years back, Della had heard, and she'd kept the ranch running on her own. "You're the one who sorted out the Rourke kitchen," Helen said. She didn't make it a question. "I made some adjustments," Della said. "Barton tells me you negotiated a forward supply contract in October," Helen said. "Sensible timing. I should have done the same." She glanced across the room. "Don't mind Victoria. She's been circling that man since his wife passed, and she's annoyed someone moved in before she could." Della blinked. Helen delivered information like she threw fence posts, with force and no decoration. "I wasn't aware it was a race," Della said. "Everything's a race when you're Victoria Ashford," Helen said, with the brisk pragmatism of someone who had neither the time nor the inclination for social games. "You seem like you've got sense. Don't let her get under your skin. She's only powerful as long as people let themselves care what she thinks." "Is that what you do? Not care?" Helen smiled, brief and dry. "I care plenty. I just decide what's worth caring about." She excused herself and moved on, leaving Della slightly stunned and oddly grateful. The real moment came later when the room had thinned somewhat and people were beginning to collect coats. Della was near the door, speaking with the wife of one of the smaller ranchers about a bread recipe, a genuine conversation, the woman had asked, when she became aware that Victoria had positioned herself nearby with the accuracy of someone who'd been planning the approach. The woman Della was speaking with noticed too, and her eyes shifted slightly, and the conversation lost its ease. Victoria inserted herself without appearing to force it, a social technique that required practice to execute, and she had clearly practiced. "Mrs. Rourke," she said. The title came out with a particular inflection, not quite mocking, but in the same neighborhood. "Miss Ashford," Della said. The other woman had found somewhere else to be. "I hope you're finding the valley comfortable," Victoria said. "Winter can be quite something out here for people who aren't accustomed to it." "I'm managing fine," Della said. "I'm sure." Victoria's eyes moved over her the way they'd moved over her that first day in the yard, assessing, cataloging, deciding. "It's generous of Caleb to make things comfortable for you. He's always been a considerate man." "He's a good partner," Della said. The word was deliberate. She watched it land. Victoria's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "I've known Caleb for many years," she said, "since long before his arrangement with you. I think it's important for the people in this community to understand the context of certain situations, to know the full picture." "I imagine most people here know whatever picture you've chosen to show them," Della said. She kept her voice completely even. "I'm not in a position to control that, and I'm not particularly interested in trying." Victoria looked at her. "You're very direct." "I find it saves time," Della said. "Yes." Victoria's smile returned, sharpened. "That's what women without social capital usually discover, bluntness as a substitute for influence." The words landed with the precision of something thrown hard at a specific target. Della felt them. She'd be lying to herself if she said she didn't. In the place where the old worries lived, the ones about whether she was enough, whether belonging was something that could be built or only inherited. The doubt moved through her like a current. She let it pass. "If you'll excuse me," she said, and walked toward where Caleb was standing without hurrying. He saw her coming. He read something in her face, not distress, she hadn't let it become that, but something, and his eyes moved past her to where Victoria was standing, and his expression settled into something flat and unreadable. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They left. In the wagon on the way back, Caleb said, "What did she say to you?" Della considered what to answer. "She reminded me that I don't have social capital," she said. In those words, the muscle in Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's not entirely wrong," Della said before he could respond. "I don't have what she has. I didn't come from a family with a name in this valley. I didn't arrive with money or connections or a history that people already know." She looked at the road ahead. "But she's wrong about what that means. And I'm not going to spend energy arguing her version of things when I can just keep working." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "You shouldn't have to hear that." "People say things," she said. "I've heard worse." "That doesn't make it all right." "No," she agreed. "But it makes it manageable." She looked at him. "I'm not broken by it, Caleb. I want you to know that." He looked at her. A longer look. The kind that moved past the practical surface of things into something underneath. "I know," he said. "That's not what worries me." She waited. "What worries me," he said slowly, like he was working it out as he said it, "is that she gets to keep saying it, that you have to just absorb it, keep working, and she faces nothing." Della nodded. She understood that. The unfairness of it was real. "But the answer to that isn't anything you can do right now," she said. "It's time. It's me building enough of a real presence here that the other version of things stops being interesting." She paused. "And the county fair?" He glanced at her. "I'm entering the fair," she said, "in the spring, when it comes around. The preserves competition." A beat of silence. "The sour cherry," he said. "Among others. But yes." He looked back at the road. He said nothing for a moment and then said very quietly, "Margaret used to enter that competition." "I know," she said. "You don't have to be all right with it. I just wanted you to know what I was planning." He drove. The cold air came around the wagon's canvas, and the horses moved steadily through the dark. "She would have entered against you," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that was both grief and something else she couldn't quite name. "She would have competed like hell and made a complete event of it." A pause. "She would have liked the fight." "Maybe I would have given her one," Della said. He made a sound, rough, brief, that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. It was over quickly, but it had been real, and she filed it away the way she filed away things that mattered. February brought an incident that reorganized several things at once. It started with Roland, the young hand who'd been homesick since October. He'd been doing better. The situation with Declan had resolved itself into something functional, and he'd stopped the overcompensating that had caused the original friction. But mid-February, he developed a cough that turned into something more serious over the course of a week, and by the time Della noticed how bad it had gotten, he was running a fever that made his face look wrong and his eyes unfocused. She found out because she went to the bunkhouse to return a tool she'd borrowed from Coop, and Roland was sitting on his bunk in his coat in the middle of the day, which was not something cowboys did unless they were unable to stand. "How long?" she said. He looked up. "Ma'am? How long have you been this sick?" He started to say it was nothing. She could see the denial forming, and she didn't let him. "Don't," she said. "I can see you from across the room. How long?" He admitted to 4 days of worsening symptoms, 4 days in which he'd kept working, or trying to, because he was 19 and scared of appearing weak, and didn't know who to tell or how to say it. She went back to the main house and told Caleb they needed to get the doctor from town. Caleb sent Pete on horseback immediately, no questions asked. Then he looked at her. "How bad?" "Bad enough that waiting isn't an option," she said. "Chest fever. He needs proper attention." Caleb went out to the bunkhouse himself. She heard later from Coop that he'd sat with Roland for a while, asked him questions, and told him in the direct, no-ceremony way that was his natural register that nobody was going to think less of him for being sick, and that he should have said something sooner. Coop said Roland had looked like a man who'd been given permission for something he hadn't known he needed permission for. The doctor, a spare, efficient man named Graves who'd been in the valley 12 years, arrived by evening and confirmed a chest infection that was serious but treatable with rest, warmth, and specific care. He gave instructions, left medicine, and charged a fee that Caleb paid without looking at the amount. Della set up a proper sick corner in the bunkhouse, organized a rotation of broth and warm food every few hours, and checked Roland's temperature 3 times a day. It took 10 days, but he turned the corner. The day he came back to light duty, visibly thinner but standing and functional, 3 of the older hands shook his hand in a way that conveyed something larger than welcome back. Coop told him, apparently with total seriousness, that if he'd died it would have been inconvenient for everyone, and Roland had laughed. And it was a real laugh, the kind that belonged to someone who finally felt like they were somewhere they fit. Gideon came to Della afterward. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, as had become his habit when he was about to say something he considered important. "That boy would have pushed through until he collapsed," he said. "I know," she said. "You caught it." Someone needed to be paying attention. She looked at him. "Now they all know that someone is. That's the point, Gideon." He turned his hat in his hands once. "This crew," he said, "is different than it was in September." He said it like a fact he was still working out the implications of. "I don't know how to explain it exactly." "You don't have to explain it," she said. "Just keep running it the way you do. That's your part. This is mine." He nodded and put his hat back on. The thing with the garden happened in late February, and she hadn't planned it. There'd been a warm spell. Brief. The kind that frontier winters occasionally produce just to remind you spring was theoretically possible. And she'd gone outside to check whether the kitchen herb pots had survived a recent hard frost. She walked along the south side of the house and stopped at the garden gate the way she sometimes did, not going in, just looking through the wood slats at the shape of the space inside. The frost had broken something in one of the fruit trees. A limb, about halfway up the left one, had split under ice accumulation and was hanging at an angle that would damage the tree further once the temperature dropped again. The split was recent. She could see the white wood exposed. She stood at the gate for a long time. Then she went and found a pruning saw in the equipment shed and came back. She unlatched the gate and went in. The garden was smaller inside than it had seemed from outside, or maybe more intimate was the right word. The beds laid out with care, the stone path still mostly intact beneath the weeds. The 2 fruit trees at the back with their years of untended growth making them look older than they probably were. Someone had put real thought into this space. You could still see it in the bones, underneath all the neglect. She went to the damaged tree and cut the broken limb cleanly where it needed to come off. It took about 10 minutes. The cut was good. Clean angle, correct place, the kind of pruning cut that would heal. She carried the broken limb out and laid it by the fence. She was latching the gate when she heard steps. Caleb was standing 15 feet away. He'd come around the side of the house and stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the pruning saw. He looked at the broken limb on the ground. She met his eyes and held them. "The limb was split," she said. "It would have damaged the tree." A long silence. She didn't apologize. She'd gone into a space he'd asked her not to enter, and she'd done it because a living thing needed attention, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. If that was wrong, she'd hear it. But she wasn't going to walk it back with an apology she didn't actually feel. Something moved through his expression, something complicated that went through at least 3 different things in the space of a few seconds. She didn't try to read all of them. "Is that all you did?" he said finally. His voice was careful. "That's all I did," she said. He looked at the gate, at the limb, back at her. "All right," he said. He walked away. She stood by the gate and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That hadn't been a resolution. It hadn't been forgiveness or permission or any kind of clean accounting. It was messier than that, and she knew it, and she knew he knew it, and she suspected that both of them were going to be sitting with that moment for a while. She put the saw away and went back to the kitchen. What? He came to dinner that evening and sat in his usual place, and she put food on the table and sat at her end, and they ate in the familiar silence. But it had changed texture again, the silence. There was something live in it now. After a while, he said, "It was her favorite one, the left tree." Della looked at him. "I figured it was the left one," she said carefully. "It looked like it had been pruned more carefully than the other. More recently, I mean, before everything." He nodded, looked at his plate. "She used to make preserves from those cherries." Della set down her fork. "Caleb." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to replace her," she said. "I need you to understand that. I'm not trying to take over something that was hers, or pretend that she wasn't here, or ask you to let go of any of it. That's not what I was doing in that garden. I know that, he said. Do you? A pause. His hands settled on the table. Yeah, he said. I do. He was quiet for a moment. He stopped, started again. I've kept everything exactly as it was because if I touch it, it means something changed, and I wasn't ready for it to mean that. It already changed, she said gently. 3 years ago. You can't preserve it by leaving it alone. You're just letting it fall apart slowly instead of all at once. He looked at her for a long time. That tree, he said, would have come down by spring if nobody touched it. Yes, she said, and now it won't. No. He picked up his fork, ate in silence for a moment, then, I'm going to go into the garden in the spring, start cleaning it up. Della nodded. She didn't say anything extravagant, she just said, all right. I'm not asking for help with it. I know. It's in there, he said, with the careful attention of a man handling something fragile. There's a bed along the east wall that gets good morning sun. Margaret never got around to planting it. Della looked at him. I'll find a place for them, she said. Oh. March arrived, and with it, a shift in the situation with Victoria that nobody had quite predicted. The community event was a pre-fair gathering, a social held at the Ashford House, the largest private residence in the valley, which Victoria hosted every year with the flawless efficiency of someone who understood that control of a room was a form of power. Attendance was expected from all the significant ranching families. Declining was considered a statement. Caleb had been going for years. He told Della about it with the expression of a man disclosing an obligation he'd like to avoid, but understood was non-negotiable. You don't have to come, he said. Will it look strange if I don't? Yes, he admitted. Then I'm coming, she said. The Ashford house was everything Victoria's behavior implied it would be. Large, impeccably maintained, full of expensive furniture and decorative objects that announced money without appearing to try. Victoria received guests in the front parlor with the ease of a woman on her own terrain. She welcomed Caleb warmly, the particular warmth of long-standing familiarity, and then turned to Della with a precisely calibrated smile. Mrs. Rourke, how lovely that you could make the journey. It's only 3 miles, Della said pleasantly. The evening proceeded. Della moved through it with attention, talking to Helen Marsh, who was there with the same dry pragmatism she brought to every situation, and the doctor's wife, who turned out to have strong opinions about preserving methods, and several of the smaller ranching families who'd been circling her with careful curiosity since January, and seemed relieved to find her normal. She was in conversation with 2 women near the fireplace when she heard her name from across the room. Not spoken to her. Spoken about her, in a voice that carried with the confidence of someone who wasn't attempting to hide. Victoria's voice. Came with nothing, of course. These arrangements always involve a certain element of desperation. Caleb's been good to give her a situation. He's always been generous to a fault. But one can't pretend it's a marriage in any meaningful sense when one party is essentially employed. Della did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the woman she was speaking to and watched the woman's expression shift through a series of things. Discomfort, embarrassment, an anxious glance toward where Victoria was speaking, then back to Della with something that was almost apology. Della smiled at her, calm and unhurried. You were saying, she said, that your daughter has been learning to put up fruit preserves. The woman blinked, recovered. Yes, she's been trying apple butter first. Apple butter is a good starting place, Della said. The technique's forgiving. Once she's got the timing down, the rest follows. She could feel the room recalibrating around her. People who'd heard Victoria's voice, and most of them had, she'd intended to be heard, were watching Della now, waiting to see the impact. They were watching her continue a conversation about apple butter with total composure, and she could see in their faces the moment they stopped seeing her as Victoria's subject and started seeing her as something else. When the conversation ended naturally, she turned. Caleb was across the room. He'd been there for at least the last 2 minutes. She could tell from his posture that he'd heard. His face was controlled, but barely. She knew his expressions well enough by now to read what was underneath the control. A cold, contained fury that was looking for an appropriate outlet in a room where making a scene would be wrong. She walked to him. Don't, she said quietly when she reached him. She, I know what she said. Della kept her voice low. And everyone in this room heard her say it. That's working against her, not against me, if you'll let it. But if you say something right now in this room, you make it into a confrontation, and that gives her the drama she wants. She met his eyes. Let it sit. Let people think about what they heard. He was quiet for a moment, jaw tight. She called you an employee. She implied it, Della said. And in doing so, she told everyone in this room that she's been thinking about my position in your life closely enough to have formed an opinion about it. Let them figure out why. He looked at her. He stopped. What? I was going to say calm, he said. But that's not exactly it. No, she said. It's not calm. I'm furious. But being furious in this room right now doesn't help us. She straightened. Take me home. We've stayed long enough. He offered her his arm. She took it. They said their polite goodbyes and walked out. In the wagon, neither of them spoke for the first mile. Then Caleb said, without preamble, I'm going to say something at the spring fair, publicly. Della looked at him. Not a confrontation, he said. Not a fight. But I'm going to make something clear, in front of people, because what she did tonight that can't just go. Some things can be ignored and some things can't. What do you want to say? She said. He thought for a moment. The truth, he said. That's all. Just the actual truth about who you are and what you've done for the ranch. He paused. Would that bother you? She considered it. No, she said. That wouldn't bother me at all. He nodded. They rode the rest of the way in the dark, and she sat beside him on the bench and felt the cold air and the motion of the wagon and the particular weight of a winter that had been long and hard and was almost over. The fair was 6 weeks out. The cherry preserves were on the shelf. The tree in the garden had been cut clean and would put out growth by April. She had work to do. She was ready to do it. The last thing that happened before spring broke the cold was small, and she almost missed it. She was in the kitchen very early one morning, the dark still full outside, the stove just warming, when she heard the south gate. The particular sound of the latch she'd come to know. She didn't go to the window. She stood at the stove and listened. Footsteps in the garden, moving slowly along what she imagined was the stone path. A long silence. Then, after a while, the gate again, and the footsteps going back toward the main house. She turned back to the stove. She didn't say anything about it at breakfast. He didn't either. But when he came through the kitchen for his coffee and she handed it to him, he looked at her for a second longer than usual, and she saw in his face something she hadn't seen there before. Not happiness exactly, but the early, fragile predecessor of it. The expression of a man who had, in the dark and alone and on his own terms, done something he'd been unable to do for 3 years. She handed him his coffee. Cold morning, she said. It'll warm up, he said. He took his coffee and went out to start the day. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the quiet of the house settling around her and thought that there were some kinds of progress that didn't announce themselves, that happened in the dark before anyone was watching, and that those were often the ones that held. Spring came to Coldwater Valley the way it always did in that country. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with the winter. A back and forth of warm days and hard frosts that kept everyone uncertain until one morning you woke up and the light was different and you understood that the cold had finally lost. Della noticed it first in the kitchen garden. The herbs she'd moved to the east bed inside the south gate, the ones Caleb had told her Margaret never got around to planting, pushed up through the soil in the second week of April with the particular insistence of things that had been waiting. She checked them every morning, not hovering, just looking, making sure. The garden itself had changed. Caleb had been working it on his own, the way he'd said he would, in the early mornings before the crew was fully up. She didn't watch him do it, and she didn't offer to help. She'd see the evidence afterward, a bed turned over, a section of path reset where the stones had heaved in the frost, the second fruit tree properly pruned now to match the first. He didn't mention it, and neither did she. It was his to do on his own terms, and she respected that the way she'd want her own private work respected. What she did notice was that he came to breakfast differently on the mornings he'd been out there. Not lighter, exactly. Caleb Rourke was not a light man, and she didn't expect him to become one, but less compressed, like something inside had been given a small amount of room and had taken it. She put extra on his plate those mornings and said nothing about why. The fair was 5 weeks out when she started the serious preparation. The sour cherry preserves were already made, the January batch that had been sitting on the shelf through the whole winter, properly sealed, the flavor deepening the way preserves did when they were given time. She uncapped one jar to taste in early April and stood over it for a moment before deciding it was right. Not perfect. Preserves were never what you wanted them to be right out of the jar. There was always something you'd adjust next time. But right. The balance between the tartness and the sweet, the texture, the way the cherry held together without turning to mush. It was good work, and she knew it. She was also entering a baked goods category. A dense, dark molasses bread she'd been making for the crew all winter and had refined over a dozen batches into something she was genuinely proud of. The recipe was her mother's, adjusted through years of working with different ovens and flour qualities. It had the particular quality of food that had been worked on honestly. Nothing fancy, nothing trying to be something it wasn't, just doing exactly what it was supposed to do and doing it well. She spent 2 weeks making practice batches and adjusting ratios. Coop, who had developed an opinion on the bread over the winter without apparently intending to, served as her most reliable taster. He ate whatever she put in front of him and then sat quietly and then said either same as last time or better than last time. And she'd learned to trust that assessment because he was consistent and he didn't flatter. Better than last time, he said on the 14th batch. You're sure? He tore another piece off. Ate it. Yeah, he said. That was good enough. Gideon came to her 2 weeks before the fair with the look he got when something had happened that he'd been hoping to handle without her involvement and had concluded he couldn't. Victoria Ashford is entering the preserves competition, he said. Della looked up from the table where she was checking her supply inventory. I know. She enters every year. She's been talking about it in town. He shifted his weight. Telling people she's sourcing specialty fruit from a supplier in St. Louis, saying she brought in a particular kind of sugar from an Eastern importer. A pause. She's been very loud about it. Della set down her pencil. She's trying to intimidate me out of entering. That's what it looks like. It won't work, Della said. Gideon looked at her steadily. He was not a man who offered reassurance, but there was something in his expression, a particular quality of seriousness, that conveyed something close to confidence. No, he said. I don't suppose it will. He put his hat on and went back out to the yard. She sat for a moment after he left, looking at the wall, and then picked up her pencil and kept working. The thing about Victoria's strategy was that it misunderstood what it was competing against. Imported sugar and specialty fruit were not nothing. They produced results that money could produce, but they didn't produce the specific quality that came from knowing your ingredients the way Della knew hers. She knew the cherries she'd worked with. She'd tasted them at 3 different stages, understood their water content, adjusted her technique to account for the specific tartness of that particular batch. That was knowledge you couldn't purchase from a supplier in St. Louis. It came from paying attention to the actual material in front of you, over time, and adjusting accordingly. She wasn't arrogant about it. She'd been wrong before, miscalculated a batch, produced something that went into the slop pail because it wasn't worth keeping. Competence didn't make you immune to failure. But she knew the work she'd put into this particular jar, and she trusted it. Yet, Caleb came into the kitchen on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks before the fair and stood in the doorway with the expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he'd made a decision and was figuring out how to say it. She waited. I've been thinking about what I said in the wagon, he said, after Victoria's party, about saying something at the fair. I remember. I want to do it right. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table. He'd stopped hovering in doorways sometime in February, she'd noticed, and she'd said nothing about it. Not a speech, not a confrontation, but there are things I should have said months ago and didn't say because I don't know, keeping my own counsel, waiting to see. And now you've seen, she said. I've seen, he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. You came here with nothing. You turned this kitchen around in 2 weeks. You fixed the supply situation before I'd even thought about it. You managed Roland's sickness. You sorted out the problem between 2 of my crew members. You've run this household through a hard winter in a way that... He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. In a way that I didn't know I was missing until it was here. Della looked at him. He was not a man who produced speeches. This was costing him something. And the whole time, he continued, Victoria has been in that town telling people you're a charity case, an employee. His jaw tightened. I let that go on because I didn't want to make it a drama. But letting it go on is its own statement, and it's the wrong one. What do you want to say? She said. That you're not here because I felt sorry for you, he said. That's what I want to say. That's the one thing I want everyone to hear. She held his gaze across the table. The lamp between them threw uneven light, and the kitchen smelled of the bread she'd made that morning, and outside the night was full of spring sounds, frogs and wind, and the distant movement of cattle. All right, she said. Say it. At the fair, he said. When the time comes, I'll find the moment. I trust you to, she said. He nodded. He started to get up, then stopped. Della. She waited. I'm glad you answered that advertisement, he said. It came out rough and plain, the way things did when he meant them without qualification. She was quiet for a moment. So am I, she said. Most days. His mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. Most days, he said. Don't push it, she told him. He got up and went to bed. She stayed at the table a while longer, listening to the spring sounds outside, and thought that some things didn't need to be made into more than they were. They were enough exactly as stated. The county fair arrived on the first Friday of May, which was a warm and partly cloudy day that smelled of turned earth and livestock, and the particular wooden and canvas smell of tents that only come out once a year. Coldwater Valley's fair was substantial for a frontier territory. It drew from 3 neighboring valleys and had been running for 16 years. The competition tents ran along the east side of the fairgrounds, organized by category, and the preserved goods and baked goods sections occupied a long central table watched over by 3 judges who were rotated each year to prevent favoritism. The current panel included the Millhaven postmaster, a woman named Graves, who was a distant relation of the doctor and was known for rigorous standards, and an older rancher from the neighboring valley whose name was Holt, and who was so taciturn that he communicated his verdicts almost entirely through facial expression. Della had brought 4 jars of the sour cherry preserve and 2 loaves of the molasses bread. She checked them in with the fair organizer the morning of the first day and watched them get set on the table with a dozen other entries, then walked away without looking back. The judging would happen at mid-afternoon. She had 5 hours. She walked the fairgrounds with no particular agenda. She bought coffee from a tent run by a church auxiliary and stood watching a farrier demonstration for 20 minutes because she found the work genuinely interesting. The specific knowledge required to match a shoe to a hoof correctly, the reading of the animal's gait and stance, the fine adjustment work. She ended up in conversation with the farrier's apprentice, a girl of about 17 who was explaining the difference between hot and cold shoeing with the focused confidence of someone recently converted to expertise, and Della listened with real attention because she'd always learned things most easily from people who'd just learned them themselves. She found Pete and Roland at the livestock pens. Both had come to the fair as part of a small crew contingent, which Caleb had permitted partly because the hands had worked a hard winter and deserved the outing, and partly, Della suspected, because he wanted a presence at the fair that was connected to the ranch without being conspicuous about it. Pete was eyeing a rope competition with the longing of a man who wanted to enter but hadn't yet committed. Roland was just looking at everything with the open-faced delight of someone for whom a county fair was still an event. "You should enter," she told Pete. "Might," he said. "You're good enough," she said. He glanced at her. Cowboys didn't always know what to do with direct encouragement from someone they respected, and Pete handled it by looking back at the rope competition and saying, "Might," again, and then eventually entering, which she found out later in the afternoon when Gideon mentioned it with a particular dryness. Helen Marsh found her near the vegetable displays. "Your preserves are on the table," Helen said. "So is Victoria's entry. 6 jars, displayed with a linen cloth underneath them." "I know," Della said. She also brought a framed certificate from the St. Louis supplier attesting to the quality of the fruit. Helen said this with an expression that communicated her opinion of that choice without any additional words. "That's between her and the judges," Della said. Helen looked at her. "You're remarkably unfazed." "I did the work," Della said. "The jar is either good or it isn't. Standing next to it worrying won't change anything." Sensible, Helen said. Also maddening to watch. Della smiled. Did you enter anything? Root vegetables, Helen said. I've won that category 4 years running, and I expect to again. She said it without arrogance, just a person accurately reporting her area of established competence. Della found it deeply refreshing. They walked a section of the fair together, talking about the winter just past, about spring planting, about the water situation on Helen's property, which shared a creek line with 2 other ranches and had produced ongoing negotiations every year since she'd owned it. Helen talked the way she did everything, directly, efficiently, with no pretense and no shortage of dry opinion. Della liked her more with each conversation. Caleb was at the fair. He moved through it with the particular contained quality of a man who was somewhere because it was expected of him, which was different from somewhere because he wanted to be there. He spoke to people who stopped him, and many did, because Rourke Ranch's standing in the valley meant he drew attention without seeking it, but he moved steadily, working through the fairgrounds in a pattern that suggested he was heading somewhere without making it obvious. Victoria intercepted him near the equipment displays. Della saw it happen from 30 yards away, near the baked goods tent, and she watched because she needed to understand what she was dealing with. Victoria stopped him with the ease of long familiarity. A hand on his arm, a turn to face him, the positioning of someone claiming a conversational territory. Caleb stopped and stood and listened with the polite stoniness he deployed when he was waiting for a conversation to end. She couldn't hear what Victoria said. She could read the shape of it, solicitous, warm, the practiced warmth that was Victoria's social instrument. She could also read Caleb's response, which was brief and conclusory, and then the moment he stepped back and disengaged, and Victoria's face as he walked away, which went through something real before she reassembled it. He found Della near the coffee tent an hour later. She asked if I was entering anything in the competition, he said. She already knows you're not, Della said. Yes, he said. She wanted me to mention that she was entering the preserves category. And what did you say? That I hoped she did well, he said flatly. Which is true. I hope she does well, just not better than you. Della looked at him. Is that too blunt? He said. No, she said. That's about right. The judging began at 1:30. Della stayed away from the competition tent for the first 30 minutes. She was watching Pete's rope competition, which he was performing with concentrated skill, and she'd made a commitment to herself not to hover. The work was done. The jar was either good or it wasn't. She went to the tent when word passed through the fairgrounds that results were being posted. The competition tent was crowded by the time she arrived, not exclusively because of the preserves, but because preserved goods and baked goods were categories that a significant portion of the valley's women had strong opinions about, and the results always drew a cluster. She worked through the edge of the crowd to a position where she could see the results table. The judging notes were arranged by category. She found the preserved goods section. She read it once. Then again. First place, sour cherry preserve, D. Rourke, Rourke Ranch. The note from the judges, written in the postmaster's precise hand, cited balance of acid and sugar, texture of the fruit, clarity of the preserving liquid, and what the postmaster had apparently described, with slight self-consciousness, as a quality of genuine craftsmanship that distinguishes this entry from technically correct alternatives. She stood there with the paper in her hand. The molasses bread had placed second in the baked goods category, behind a woman from the neighboring valley whose apple cake had apparently been, by all accounts, extraordinary. Second was fine, second was honest. She'd tasted the apple cake at the judging table and it deserved its ribbon. But the sour cherry preserve. She stood with the paper in her hand and felt something that was not triumph, exactly, because triumph implied an opponent, and the preserves hadn't been made against Victoria. They'd been made for their own sake, from her best knowledge and her specific care and a winter's worth of patience. What she felt was closer to confirmation, that the work had been the right work, that attention and genuine effort produced something real, regardless of what anyone thought of the person who'd made it. She set the paper down carefully and straightened. Behind her, someone started clapping. Not the polite scattered applause of a crowd reacting to a posted result. A few people, deliberate and sustained, and then more joining. She turned. Caleb was standing 8 feet away, and he was not the one clapping. He wasn't the clapping type. But he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something open in it. something that had stopped being careful. Pete was clapping, and Roland beside him, and Helen Marsh across the tent with her arms crossed, and a small, satisfied expression that was the Helen Marsh equivalent of a standing ovation. Even two of the women she didn't know well joined in, and Victoria was across the tent, standing with her results, third place, which was not what her imported fruit and linen cloth presentation had been designed to produce, and looking at the scene with an expression that was working very hard to maintain its composure. Della met her eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at her, steadily and without particular feeling, for long enough to let it be acknowledged, and then looked away. Caleb reached her through the crowd. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the noise of the tent moved around them. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I want to say something," he said. "Now, is that all right?" She understood immediately what he meant. She looked around the tent. The crowd was still there, still paying attention, the energy of the results still moving through the space. "Yes," she said. He raised his voice, not dramatically. He didn't have a dramatic bone in him, but clearly with the natural projection of a man used to giving instructions across wide spaces. "I want to say something about my wife." The tent went quiet with the particular speed that spaces go quiet when a man of established authority speaks without warning. He wasn't looking at Victoria. He was looking at the general company with the matter-of-fact directness of someone delivering information rather than making a scene. "There's been talk in this valley this winter," he said, "about who Della is and why she's at Rourke Ranch. I've let that talk go on longer than I should have because I don't care for drama and I assumed the facts would speak for themselves." A pause. "The facts have been speaking, but some people have been talking over them." The tent was very still. "Della Voss came to this ranch in September with nothing but her knowledge and her willingness to work," he said. "She rebuilt a kitchen in 2 weeks that had been broken for 3 years. She reorganized our supply system and prevented a winter shortage I hadn't seen coming. She has managed 20 men, a full household, and every operational problem that's come across her path since she arrived, without complaint and without recognition." He paused. "She has done all of this while being told by certain people in this community that she doesn't belong here because she didn't arrive with money or a family name." He looked across the tent, not at Victoria specifically, just across the gathered company, the way a man looks when he's speaking to a room rather than a person. "She's not at Rourke Ranch because I felt sorry for her," he said. "She's there because she has earned every inch of ground she stands on, and this valley, and the people in it, would do well to understand the difference between a person who has everything handed to them and a person who builds everything themselves." He stopped. "That's all I have to say." The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Helen Marsh began clapping again, and this time it spread through the tent with genuine conviction, and Roland let out a sound that was technically a whoop before catching himself and converting it into a cough that didn't fool anyone. And Pete was grinning in the uncomplicated way of someone who'd wanted to see exactly this happen for a long time. Della stood in the middle of it and breathed. She hadn't expected to feel what she felt. Not the winning. She'd hoped for that, worked for it, understood the odds. But this, being spoken for in plain language by a man who did not use plain language casually, being named specifically as a person who had built something rather than received it. She'd been told her whole life in various ways by various people that what she had was not enough. Not the right family, not the right money, not the right position. She'd gotten used to carrying that as background noise, the constant low static of being insufficient in ways she hadn't chosen. She didn't know what to do with its absence. Caleb was beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the crowd with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who'd done what needed doing and was now ready for the event to be over. She touched his arm, briefly. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." But Victoria left the tent without speaking to either of them. Della watched her go. The straight back, the controlled exit, the absence of any visible crack in the composure, and felt nothing vindictive. The woman had been outmaneuvered by the simple process of someone doing good work and someone else telling the truth about it. There was nothing in that to feel superior about. If anything, she felt a kind of tired remove, the way you feel at the end of a long effort when you realize you've come through to the other side. She found Helen in the crowd afterward. "Well done," Helen said. "For the preserves?" "For all of it." Helen looked at her evenly. "You didn't fight her. You just outlasted her. That's harder than fighting." Della considered that. Fighting would have been satisfying, though. "Deeply," Helen agreed, "but satisfaction fades. What you've built over this winter doesn't." They walked out of the tent into the afternoon sun. The fairgrounds were still busy around them, livestock and demonstrations, and the smell of food from the far end, and the world was going about its business in the comfortable, unimpressed way that worlds do, regardless of whatever momentous things have happened inside any given tent on any given afternoon. Pete had placed second in the rope competition and was trying to look like this was adequate while clearly being pleased. Roland had apparently befriended a boy from one of the other valley ranches, and they were watching the farrier demonstration together with the focused attention of young men storing away information they might one day find useful. Gideon was near the wagon, waiting, in the manner of a man who had attended the fair as a duty and had completed that duty and was ready to return to work. Della walked to him. "You heard?" she said. "Hard not to," he said. "The tent isn't that big. What did you think?" He looked at her steadily. "I think Caleb said what needed saying," he said, "and I think you earned the right to have it said." He looked away, out at the fairgrounds. "That's what I think." From Gideon, that was a soliloquy. She took it as it was meant. Oh. The drive back to the ranch was easy. Late afternoon light, the horses unhurried, the crew spread across two wagons with the loose, spent quality of people who'd had a day that was mostly good. Pete had his second-place ribbon tied to his hat brim for reasons that were opaque but clearly felt necessary. Roland had fallen asleep against the side of the wagon before they'd cleared the fairgrounds. Della sat beside Caleb on the front wagon. They were quiet for a while the way they were comfortable being quiet. Then she said, "You didn't have to name me." "What do you mean?" "What you said in the tent. You could have spoken about the ranch, the work, kept it general. You chose to name me specifically." He thought about this. "Would you have preferred that?" "No," she said. "I'm saying it mattered that you didn't." He nodded slowly, watching the road. "You've been carrying around someone else's story about you for long enough," he said. "I thought you deserved to have your own version put on record." She was quiet for a moment. The road ran ahead of them through the spring land, the hills greening up on either side, the sky doing the particular things that spring skies do in that country, moving, layered, full of change. "I've been thinking," she said. "About?" "About the fact that I've been here 8 months," she said. "And I know this ranch, I know your crew, I know your systems, your suppliers, your weak points, your strengths." She paused. "I know you." He glanced at her. "I came here on a practical arrangement," she said, "and I've kept it practical in my head, even when it started to be more than that, because I didn't want to build anything on assumptions." She looked at her hands in her lap. "But I think I've been here long enough to know that what I'm building here is real, and I'd like to stop treating it like it might not be." The wagon moved along the road. The light was starting to go golden at the edges. "What are you saying?" Caleb said. "I'm saying I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I don't want to." She met his eyes. "That's different." He looked at her for a long moment, then back at the road. "Yeah," he said, "that's different." They rode the rest of the way to the ranch in a silence that had changed again, changed into something that didn't need to be resolved or named or made into more than it was right now, sitting in a wagon in the spring evening with the sound of the horses and the crew behind them and the ranch coming into view ahead. The preserves ribbon was folded in her coat pocket. The first-place notation, in the postmaster's careful handwriting, pressed flat against her ribs. She thought about her mother's recipe, adjusted over 100 batches. About her father's farm, the land that had gone under, the letter that never came, the advertisement pinned crooked to a board in a post office 3 days' ride from anywhere. She thought about all the places she hadn't stayed and the one she was going to. The ranch came around the last bend in the road and settled into view. The main house, the barns, the paddocks, and beyond them the rolling land going all the way to the hills. The kitchen window was dark, but it would be lit again inside an hour. The herb beds in the south garden were growing. The tree she'd pruned was putting out new wood. She looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Felt it as a physical fact in her chest, uncomplicated and solid. She was home. Not the home she'd come from, not the home she'd lost, but the one she'd made, with her hands and her knowledge and her stubbornness and her willingness to stay when staying was the harder choice. The wagon rolled through the gate. Caleb pulled the horses to a stop. Around them, the crew began the easy unwinding of people returning to a familiar place, unhitching, stabling, drifting toward the bunkhouse and the barn with the comfortable competence of men who knew exactly where they were and what came next. Della climbed down. She stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the ranch in the evening light, and then she rolled up her sleeves and went into the kitchen to start dinner. The dinner she made that evening was nothing special: beans and salt pork, cornbread from the last of the good meal, a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The crew came through the line with the loose, tired ease of people who'd had a day worth having, and Pete still had his ribbon on his hat, and Roland ate 2 full portions without apology. And Gideon drank his coffee in the doorway the way he always did, looking out at the darkening yard like a man conducting a final inspection of the day. Nobody made a speech about the fair. Nobody needed to. That was the thing Della had come to understand about this particular group of men. They communicated significance the way the land communicated weather, through atmosphere rather than announcement. The fact that Coop refilled her coffee without being asked, that Roland said goodnight to her specifically on his way out, that Gideon paused in the doorway before leaving and said simply, "Good day?" with the weight of a man who chose his words the way a jeweler chose stones. These things meant more than any ceremony would have. She cleaned the kitchen alone, the way she preferred to at the end of the day. The quiet of it was necessary. The hour after everyone was fed and gone was hers, the one unscheduled pocket in a schedule that started before sunrise and rarely gave her room to simply stand still. She put the preserves ribbon on the shelf above the stove. Not prominently, she wasn't interested in display, but somewhere she could see it when she was working. A reminder that the work was real, that it had been recognized by people with no stake in flattering her, that patience and genuine effort produced something that held up under examination. She thought about her mother while she washed the last of the pots. The recipe that had won that afternoon had been her mother's original, modified across 20 years of Della's own adjustments, until it had become something that was her mother's and hers simultaneously. You couldn't always separate the things you'd inherited from the things you'd made. Sometimes the inheritance was the foundation, and the making was the structure, and neither one stood without the other. She thought that was probably true about more than bread. Caleb was in the garden when she went out to check the latch on the south gate before bed. She saw the lamp through the slats, a low, steady light moving slowly along what she knew was the stone path. She stopped. She could have gone back inside. He hadn't asked her to be there, and he'd done all his garden work alone, in the early mornings, in the private way he'd claimed for himself. But the lamp stopped moving, and after a moment his voice came through the dark. "You can come in if you want," he said. She unlatched the gate. The garden at night was a different thing than the garden in daylight. She'd been in it in the daytime now. The herbs needed tending. She came through the east gate in the mornings. But at night, with the lamp and the spring smell of turned earth and growing things, it was quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Caleb was standing near the far bed, the one closest to the fruit trees. The lamp sat on the flat stone at the edge of the path. He was looking at the left tree, Margaret's favorite, the one with the pruning cut from February, which had put out a good flush of new growth exactly where it should have. "It's going to fruit this year," he said. Della looked at the tree. New wood, properly healed, the structure of it better now than it had been. "It'll be a small crop," she said. "First year after pruning usually is." "That's fine," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." She stood beside him, and they looked at the tree together. The lamp threw uneven light across the beds, and the path, and the near fence, and above them the sky was thick with stars, and the frogs were loud from the creek half a mile north. "She planted this tree the spring we arrived," he said. Hauled it herself from a nursery in Millhaven in a canvas bag on the back of a horse. Said if she was going to live here, she wanted something that would outlast her. He was quiet for a moment. She was right. It did. Della didn't say anything. She'd learned over these months that some things required witness rather than response. "I was angry at it for a while," he said, "after she died. Angry at the whole garden. That sounds..." I know how it sounds. It sounds human, Della said. He looked at her. You loved her and she was gone and the things she'd made were still here, Della said. That's not an irrational thing to feel, it's just a hard one. He was quiet. Then, I kept it locked because if I went in, I'd have to admit she was really gone, and I wasn't ready to do that for a long time. He looked back at the tree. I'm ready now. I know, she said. I've been watching you get there. He glanced at her with something that might have been surprise or might have been recognition. You didn't push, he said. It wasn't mine to push, she said. You needed to get there on your own. She paused. Most things have to happen on their own timeline. You can't force a cut to heal by pressing on it. He made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a laugh, but related to one. You've been patient with a lot of things about me, he said. Things I didn't ask you to be patient with. I didn't do it for you, she said. It came out direct and true, the way direct true things did when you stopped managing your words. I did it because it was right, because this place and these people deserved someone paying attention, and I was the one there to pay it. She looked at him. I'm not asking for credit for that. I know you're not, he said. That's part of why I want to give it to you. She looked at him for a moment, this man who was hard to know and worth knowing, who communicated in the careful economy of someone who'd learned that words were finite and should be spent accordingly. There's something I want to give you, he said. He reached into his coat pocket and held out his hand. It was a key. Old iron, heavy for its size, with a simple bow and a bit that she recognized by shape, the particular profile of the kitchen's main lock, the one that had been on the door since the house was built. She'd used the key dozens of times. This was the original. I had a duplicate made when you arrived, he said. I kept the original because, I don't know, old habit, the sense that the original stays with the owner of the place. He paused. But I've been thinking about who owns this kitchen, and it's not me. I don't cook in it. I don't know what's in half the cabinets. I couldn't tell you what's stored where or why, or in what quantities. He closed her fingers around the key. You built that room. You ought to have the original. She looked down at the key in her hand. This isn't the same as the ranch, he said, and there was something careful in his voice now, something deliberate. The ranch is mine, and someday it'll pass to... I haven't figured that part out yet, but the kitchen is yours, that's what I'm saying. Whatever happens, that room is yours. She understood what he was actually saying, underneath the literal thing. He was saying she was permanent, that she had not been admitted on provisional terms that could be revisited when circumstances changed, that the foundation she'd been building on was solid, and he was telling her so in the only language he fully trusted, the concrete and the specific rather than the general and the feeling. She closed her hand around the key. I'm not going to leave, she said. I told you that in the wagon. I know, he said. I'm not giving you this because I'm afraid you'll leave. I'm giving it to you because you've earned it 10 times over and I was slow to say so. She looked at him. You're slow about most things. I know that too, he said. I've adjusted, she said. Something moved through his face, through the weathered, careful, controlled surface of it, that was warmer than anything she'd seen there in 9 months of watching. Not softness, exactly. He wasn't a soft man and she didn't want him to be. But openness. The expression of a person who has decided, finally and without reservation, to let something in. I'd like to try, he said. At the rest of it, I don't know how well I'll manage it. I'm not good at saying things, demonstrating things. He stopped. Margaret used to say I communicated in the language of actions, and she'd had to learn it like a foreign tongue. I've been learning it, Della said, since September. Are you fluent? Getting there, she said. He nodded. That was enough. Between two people who both understood that words were tools rather than decorations, it was more than enough. They stood in the garden a while longer. The lamp burned low and steady between them and the trees, and the spring night came around them with all its noise and smell and the sense of things growing in the dark, the way they always did, indifferent to human difficulty, patient and unstoppable. Summer came on gradually and then all at once, the way it did in that country. 1 week you needed a coat in the mornings, and the next the mornings were warm before 6, and the evenings held light until almost 9, and the whole rhythm of the ranch shifted to accommodate the longer days. The fruit trees in the garden produced, as Della had predicted, a modest crop, Not enough to do much with commercially, but enough for several batches of preserves and a pie that she made on a Saturday and set on the kitchen table and didn't announce. It disappeared over the course of the afternoon, piece by piece, as the crew found reasons to be near the main house. Nobody asked. She didn't offer explanation. The pie was just there, and then it was gone, and that was the whole transaction. Caleb ate the last piece at the kitchen table after dinner. He ate it slowly, the way he ate things he was actually tasting rather than just consuming. When he was done, he set the fork down and sat for a moment. "The cherries from that tree," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, that was all, but his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the lamp, and she turned back to the sink and let him have the moment privately because that was the right thing to do. Some things you witness and some things you allow. Knowing which was most of the work. Roland left in August. He'd gotten a letter from his family in the spring. His father had been injured, not seriously, but seriously enough that the farm needed an extra hand, and Roland was the only son old enough to provide one. He told Gideon first, who told Caleb, and then Roland came to the kitchen one evening with his hat in his hands and told Della himself. He was 20 now. He'd arrived at 19, homesick and overcompensating and afraid of being thought weak, and he was leaving something different, steadier, less frantic about proving himself, with the particular quiet confidence of a young man who'd gotten through a hard winter and come out the other side knowing he was capable of it. "I wouldn't have made it through last winter without you," he said. He meant the illness. He also meant more than the illness. "You made it," she said. "I just made sure someone noticed you needed help." "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He left on a Thursday with his wages, his second-place rope ribbon that Pete had given him as a going-away present with a studied casualness that hadn't fooled anyone, and a packet of food for the road that Della had put together and that was considerably larger than necessary. Coop shook his hand. Pete clapped him on the back. Gideon nodded at him in the way that meant he'd done satisfactory work, and the record was clean. Caleb shook his hand and said, "Your family's lucky to have you back." Roland looked like he wasn't entirely sure how to receive that, and then he nodded and climbed up onto his horse and rode out the gate, and didn't look back, because he was 20 and going home and looking back was for later, when you were old enough to do it without flinching. Della stood in the yard and watched until he was out of sight. She missed him before he'd cleared the gate. That was the cost of caring about people. You paid it forward, in the ordinary dailiness of attention and effort, and then you paid it again when they left, in the specific absence of the specific person. There was no way to do one without risking the other. She'd spent years trying to keep the cost low, to stay surface level with people so that loss was manageable. She'd been wrong about that strategy. The surface level life was cheaper and emptier in equal measure, and the people she'd held at a careful distance hadn't been protected from loss. She had just arranged to lose them without ever having had them. She went back inside and made dinner. The summer fair brought a different order of events than the spring one. Victoria Ashford did not enter the preserves competition in the summer fair. She sent a representative to the organization committee with a polite note citing a prior commitment. The note was read by enough people to become a fact in the valley's conversational landscape, interpreted by most of them without ambiguity. Victoria had looked at the landscape as it now stood and chosen to absent herself from a contest she could not win. This was, in its way, a conclusion. Not a dramatic one. The ending of a social contest rarely was. It simply stopped, the way a fire stops when there's nothing left for it to take. Helen Marsh mentioned it to Della, in passing, with her customary economy of ceremony. "She's redirected her energy to the Millhaven social circuit," Helen said. "She's been spending more time there this summer. I imagine she'll find her footing." "Good," Della said. She meant it. She had no interest in Victoria Ashford's ongoing diminishment. She'd never wanted the woman to fail. She'd wanted her to stop. "You're remarkably undramatic about it," Helen said. "It was never about her," Della said. "It was about the work. The work is still there." Helen looked at her for a moment with the expression she occasionally produced, a kind of considering assessment, like a farmer looking at a field and revising their estimate of its yield upward. "You're good for this valley," she said. "I want you to know that." Della blinked. Helen didn't produce compliments casually. This one landed with the weight of its rarity. "Thank you," she said. "That matters." "Don't go soft on me," Helen said, and walked away. September came. the anniversary of her arrival. She hadn't marked it on a calendar, but she knew it, in the body, the way you know significant dates that aren't holidays but have their own gravity. The anniversary of a loss, the day something changed, the morning you walked through a gate into a new life carrying everything you owned in one trunk. She'd been at Rourke Ranch for a year. Caleb found her in the kitchen in the morning, at the stove, the way it had started. He came in for his coffee, the way he did every day, and she poured it and handed it to him, the way she did every day. He took it and stood there. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she said. He drank his coffee. She started on the bread. I've been thinking, he said. She waited. About what comes next, he said. For the ranch. For the arrangement. She kept her hands in the dough. What about it? I want to talk about the land, he said. About putting your name on some of it. She stopped, looked at him. Not all of it, he said quickly. I haven't worked out all the details. But the kitchen garden, the section of the south field where you've been planning the herb expansion, the outbuilding you want to convert to a proper storage facility. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone who'd prepared for a conversation and was uncertain how it would land. Those are yours. You've built them. They should be yours on paper too, not just in practice. She looked at him for a long moment. Caleb, she said. I'm not asking anything in return, he said. This isn't a negotiation. It's a correction of something that should have been done already. That's not what I was going to say, she said. He waited. I was going to say, she said carefully, that I don't need the land on paper to know it's mine. I know what I've built here. I carry that regardless of what the deed says. She paused. But I understand why you want to formalize it, and I'm not going to refuse something that's honestly offered. He exhaled, not visibly, but she heard it, the small release of a man who'd been braced for resistance. There's a lawyer in Millhaven, he said. I'll make an appointment. All right, she said. He drank the rest of his coffee, set the cup on the table in the way he always did, in the same spot every time, one of the dozens of small habits she'd cataloged over a year of watching him move through his own kitchen. Then he looked at her. You changed this place, he said. I want to make sure you know I know that. She looked at him. This complicated, quiet, difficult man who had let her in by degrees, who had given her a key and a tree and a year of slowly increasing honesty, who was not easy and not finished and not anywhere near perfect, and who was also the person she'd chosen, not out of desperation but out of recognition. You changed a little too, she said. He considered this. A little, he admitted. That's enough, she said. That's more than enough. There is something that stays with you when you watch a person build a life from nearly nothing. Not the dramatic moments. Those are vivid but brief, and they fade the way vivid things do. What stays is the ordinary. The bread made at 4 in the morning for people who would eat it without comment. The supply list checked and rechecked against a winter that would not forgive carelessness. The patience with a grieving man's locked gate, and the willingness to wait without being asked to. Della Voss had not arrived at Rourke Ranch to become a legend. She'd arrived because she had $42 and one trunk and a notice on a post office board that said no pretense required. She'd stayed because the work was real, and the people were real, and real things turned out to be what she'd been looking for without knowing that's what she was looking for. The world tells us, consistently and from an early age, that worth is measured in what you arrive with. The name, the money, the connections, the family that gave you a running start. And the world is wrong about this. Not entirely wrong, because those things do confer advantages that are real and should be named, but wrong about the fundamental claim, which is that what you arrive with is also what you are. What you are is what you build with the arriving. Della built a kitchen and a supply system and a garden and a crew that functioned like something close to a family and a marriage that nobody would have predicted from its practical, unromantic beginning. She built these things with her hands and her knowledge and her stubbornness and her willingness to stay when staying required something from her. None of it was smooth. None of it arrived complete. The kitchen had to be rebuilt twice in different ways, once with lumber and a metal rasp and 2 borrowed cowboys, and once, more slowly, in the sense of becoming a place where people were genuinely fed and not just provisionally sustained. The marriage had to be rebuilt too, from a transaction into something that breathed. The man inside the transaction had to be found and waited for and not pushed faster than he could move. These things take time. They take more time than you think they will, and they do not tell you in advance when they'll be finished, because they're never finished. They just become stable enough to trust. Years later, the people who knew Rourke Ranch would talk about what it had been and what it became. They'd talk about the kitchen that ran like a proper operation, and the crew that was loyal past the point of economic obligation, and the herb garden that expanded every season past the original south fence boundary until it occupied an entire dedicated corner of the property. They'd talk about the preserves, sour cherry, each year, first place ribbon, without interruption, and about the woman who made them from fruit grown in a dead woman's garden that she'd tended back to life without being asked, and without taking credit. They'd talk about Caleb Rourke, who had been a man locked inside his own competence, and who had become, without anyone being able to name exactly when it happened, someone easier to know. Someone who still communicated mostly in action rather than word, but whose actions had become warmer, more considered. The kind of man who, when the young hands came through in later years, remembered what Roland had taught him about the cost of silence around a 19-year-old trying to be sufficient. They'd talk about all of it, in the way that communities talk about the things that shape them, with the mix of accuracy and myth that all such stories accumulate. But the thing that would not make it into those stories, because it never makes it into stories, being too quiet and too ordinary for the telling, was the specific morning, in the early fall of the second year, when Della stood in the kitchen before anyone else was awake, with the stove warm and the bread in the oven and the key on its hook by the door and the light just starting to come through the east window, and felt, not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for something this compound, but rightness. The sense that she was in the place she was supposed to be, doing the work she was supposed to do, with the people she was supposed to be with. Not because it had been arranged or fated or given to her, because she had made it so. There is a kind of person who arrives at a place with nothing and leaves it richer for everyone. Not in money, not in the measurable ways that get recorded and reported, but in the quality of the daily life. The sense that someone is paying attention, that the work is real and worth doing, that showing up honestly and consistently, day after day, in an imperfect and unbeautiful and thoroughly human way, is enough. More than enough. It is, in fact, the only thing that lasts. Della Rourke knew that by the end of the first year, and knew it more fully by the end of every year that followed. The unwanted bride, the mail-order wife, the woman without a name worth knowing, she never corrected those descriptions with words. She corrected them with the way the ranch ran, and the way the crew talked about it to other people, and the way the preserves tasted, and the way a man who'd been locked inside himself for 3 years walked out into a garden one February night and came back changed. She corrected it the way things are actually corrected, which is not with argument but with evidence, accumulated patient and slow, until the original claim collapses under the weight of everything it failed to account for. Outside, the valley was waking up. The horses in the paddock moved and settled. The first of the crew crossed the yard toward the barn. The light moved across the hills in the way that light does in open country, wide and unhurried, touching everything with the same indiscriminate attention. Della took the bread out of the oven and set it to cool and tied on her apron and started the coffee. Another day. The same work. The same place. Hers.